Well, Solange is with us as well. We'll look at the international papers. You're starting on you, Solange, with Germany, collapse of those talks to form a government there.
Yeah, German papers are naturally focusing on the talks, the Jamaica talks that fell apart last night, with nearly all of the papers asking who is to blame. Now, the Die Welt ran with the headline, "It's better not to govern than to reign wrong." Now, that's a translation of what FDP leader Christian Lindner said when he announced that he and his party were walking away from the talks. Die Welt attributes the breakdown to, above all, the disagreements on immigration, that compromises on Europe, finance, energy, and climate were possible, but that sticking points remained about the future of Germany's immigration policy. Now, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung has an article about the Green Party. Its leader places the blame elsewhere. He says that his party had hit its pain threshold and then some on a number of issues, but that even though they were suffering, an alliance could have been possible. He said it didn't become possible because the FDP, quote, deceived the public for weeks, and that it was, again, I quote, irresponsible, frivolous, and calculating.
You found a piece in Der Spiegel, which is asking basically whether this is all Angela Merkel's fault, isn't it?
Yeah. Der Spiegel says the blame game has begun, and that they say that at last night's talks, everyone was a loser, that the atmosphere of the month-long negotiations was one of suspicion, and that from the get-go, it just wasn't a good atmosphere. They say that the negotiations were marked by fear of, quote, being ripped, of the parties being ripped off or cheated by the other parties. Now, the paper says that there was also a lack of authority, and that's where Angela Merkel comes in. They say that she no longer commands the, quote, reverence she did even 3 years ago, and that the lack of leadership, quote, made everyone a loser last night.
Let's move on to Zimbabwe now. Local and international papers covering Robert Mugabe's decision not to step down despite being removed as head of his party.
Yeah, they went with the headline, Bob is clinging to power. The South African paper Die Burger calls Robert Mugabe's decision not to resign a strange one. They say that after 37 years as president, he is still, quote, holding on to power like a piece of lint on a wool sweater. The Business Day also says sort of the same thing in its cartoon. They've summed it up by showing Mugabe trying to stay on center stage. There, you see it right there. Despite the fact that his party, ZDF, you see on the lower right and left, wanting Mugabe to have his final curtain call. Now, the Zimbabwean papers are equally baffled. The independent paper Newsday says that this is a defining era in the country, and that it's created a shift that just a week ago would have been unimaginable. The Mail and Guardian also has an interesting analyst piece on the same issue. It says the world should not be naive or fooled into believing that changes that are going on in Zimbabwe are akin to the French Revolution. It argues that it's just a public display of party infighting, and that the military is not seeking regime change. They just want to pick who replaces Mugabe. And the paper says there are risks to such moves, such as creating violence up and down the continent.
Let's move to the US now. That news that came into us a couple of hours ago, the death of Charles Manson.
Yeah, he may not be as well known abroad as he is in the US. He is very famous there, and for masterminding a series of murders in 1969. Now, the LA Times, which is where the murders occurred in LA, goes into why he's so famous, and or in the LA area, why he's so famous and why he has remained so famous for so long when other killers, their sort of fame fades after they're caught and sentenced. Now, the Times attributes this continued fascination to the fact that his murders put an evil touch on the hippie, free love, free drugs, LSD atmosphere of the late 1960s. And the paper says that Manson became, quote, a homicidal anti-hero for a new generation, that his persona became a metaphor for evil, and that such evil still appeals to, quote, the crazies in the fringes of society.
And let's go to the UN now, children's rights.
Yeah, well, yesterday was World Man's Day. So
was it?
Yes,
okay.
It was.
I didn't even know.
And today is the UN's Universal Children's Day. Picking up on the occasion, the news website The Wire has published an article about the fight to end child labor. It says that worldwide, the number of children who are forced to work is decreasing from 162 million to 152 million in the past 4 years. So that's the good news. But the article says that the number of children working in rural areas has grown by 10 million. An article in the New York Times might give us an idea why. It says that poverty and starvation are often at the heart of why children work, and that in trying to find jobs, the children can easily become prey to human traffickers. The Times explains that in India has a massive problem with this, that anywhere between 240,000 and 500,000 children have gone missing in India in the past 5 years. The paper explains that most of these missing children aren't found and that their disappearances aren't even reported.
Solange, thanks very much. Solange Mougin looking at the newspapers for us here on France 24.